Welcome to the podcast of Frontiers of Science. I'm Jade.
And I'm Tim.
So today, I want you to just imagine for a second that your body temperature is artificially dropped down to like 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right, which is incredibly cold.
Yeah, exactly. And your heart is medically, legally stopped. The blood is physically drained from your head. And your brain waves, which they monitor with these incredibly sensitive machines, they're just totally flat.
A completely flat line.
Right. By every metric of modern clinical science, you're a corpse on an operating table. And yet somehow you are hovering near the ceiling. You're watching the surgeon actually cut open your skull, and you're listening to the exact conversation the nurses are having over in the corner of the room.
I mean, it sounds like complete science fiction, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe like some ancient mysticism. But today we are diving straight into the actual clinical reality of what happens when the human brain flatlines.
Yeah.
We're exploring the science of near-death experiences, or NDEs. And we're not just relying on old folklore or, dusty anecdotes. We're unpacking highly rigorous, newly published clinical data from 2025 and 2026.
The really recent stuff.
Exactly, along with verified medical case studies that are frankly just completely disrupting our entire understanding of human consciousness.
And before we plunge into this absolute rabbit hole, just a really quick reminder to you, our listener, to subscribe to the channel. That simple click really supports these deep, unbiased explorations into, the most profound mysteries of science.
It really is.
And we want to set the stage for you today. Whether you are listening to this as a hardened materialist who totally believes the brain is just a biological computer, or a firm believer in the human soul, or even if you're just intensely curious about that threshold between life and death.
Which I think most of us are.
Yeah, exactly. We are leaving philosophical dogmas at the door today. We are looking strictly at what the documented medical data actually tells us.
Because for centuries, the question of what happens when we die was basically locked away in the realm of theology.
Right.
Science couldn't touch it because, frankly, once you died, you stayed dead. There was no data to collect.
Right, there's no return trip.
Exactly. But the advent of modern resuscitation techniques, CPR, defibrillators, advanced intensive care, it's changed the landscape completely. We are now routinely bringing millions of people back from the absolute brink of irreversible biological death.
Yeah.
And they're returning with these accounts that are hyper-vivid, highly structured, and completely life-altering. This is, it's now a measurable empirical phenomenon happening in ICUs literally every single day.
So let's wind the clock back just a little bit to understand how we even started looking at this scientifically, because the term near-death experience feels so ubiquitous now. It's in pop culture everywhere, but it's actually relatively new.
Yeah, very true.
The initial scientific curiosity goes back to 1892, I believe, with a Swiss geologist named Albert Heim.
Right, Heim.
Yeah, he was a mountaineer, and during a climb in the Alps, he suffered this terrifying, what should have been a fatal fall. But his experience of that fall wasn't, what you would expect at all.
Far from it, actually. Because if you ask anyone what it must feel like to fall off a mountain, you'd assume the answer is just sheer, unadulterated panic.
Right, absolutely. Terror.
Just a massive dump of adrenaline, primal terror, and just this agonizing physical anticipation of the impact. But Heim experienced something entirely different. He reported this sudden expansion of time.
Wow.
He said he felt no fear, no despair at all, but rather this profound sense of peace. He experienced a rapid, objective review of his entire life playing out like a film, and he felt serene acceptance of his impending death.
That's so wild.
Yeah, and he miraculously survived, obviously. And the experience was so jarring to a scientific mind that he spent years collecting testimonies from other climbers who had survived similar falls.
And he found the exact same pattern, right?
Exactly the same.
But Heim's work was still largely treated as a psychological curiosity. It really wasn't until 1975 that the medical philosopher Raymond Moody published a book called Life After Life.
Right.
He was the one who actually officially coined the term near-death experience. Moody systematically analyzed over 100 cases of people who were declared clinically dead and then resuscitated. And what just blew the doors off the psychiatric community was the staggering consistency of their stories.
And that consistency is exactly what forces us to pay attention today. The prevalence of this phenomenon is massive. If you're listening to this thinking it's like a 1 in a million fluke,
a rare glitch.
Right, a glitch. Look at the prospective clinical studies. They indicate that between 10 to 20% of all cardiac arrest survivors report having an NDE. Just in the Western Hemisphere, we are talking about millions of human beings.
Right, and think about the biological reality of a cardiac arrest for a second. Your heart stops pumping, blood pressure just instantly drops to zero. Within seconds, the brain is entirely starved of oxygen and glucose. The lights just go out.
Total shutdown.
Yeah, the cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious thought, memory, and perception, it shuts down almost immediately. And yet, in this state of profound biological failure, 10 to 20% of these people are reporting the most hyper-lucid, highly structured experiences of their entire lives.
And we should probably define what that structure actually is for the listener.
Good idea.
Because across wildly different cultures, religions, and age brackets, the phenomenological features are shockingly uniform. It usually begins with an out-of-body experience, or an OBE.
Right.
The patient feels their consciousness cleanly separate from their physical body.
Right.
They often describe floating up near the ceiling, actually looking down at the medical team performing CPR on their own chest.
Which is terrifying to imagine.
Right, but they say they feel completely detached and totally devoid of any physical pain.
And following the OBE, there is typically a transition phase. The classic sensation of passing rapidly through a dark tunnel, or like a void, moving toward this impossibly bright, warm, and welcoming light.
Yeah, the tunnel is such a classic feature.
It is. And then encounters happen. Patients report meeting these luminous entities. Sometimes they interpret them as religious figures, depending on the person's cultural background, but very often they're deceased relatives or friends.
And sometimes relatives the patient didn't even know had died.
Yeah.
Which is something we'll get into later, because that completely breaks the hallucination theory.
Oh, for sure. And then there's the life review, which isn't just some nostalgic highlight reel, right?
No, not at all.
Patients describe this panoramic, hyper-vivid reliving of every action, word, and emotion they ever experienced. But here is the kicker, and I find this so fascinating. They often report feeling the emotional impact of their actions from the perspective of the other people involved.
Empathy on a literal level.
Yes. If they were cruel to someone, they literally feel the pain they caused. If they were kind, they feel the warmth the other person felt. It is a profoundly moral, deeply educational review.
Finally, there is a boundary. Like a fence, a river, some line in the sand, and there's this realization that if they cross it, they cannot return. They're then pulled back, often totally against their will, into the agonizing reality of a failing physical body on a hospital bed.
But studying these incredible stories as a hard science requires a lot more than just listening to anecdotes. You can't just publish a collection of cool stories in a medical journal.
No, they'd laugh you out of the room.
Exactly. You need a highly rigorous way to measure the subjective experience. You need basically a ruler.
Right.
And I'm so glad you brought up the ruler concept, because my analytical side absolutely demands a standardized metric. If we want to treat this seriously, we have to be able to separate a genuine near-death state from all the other noise happening in an ICU.
And there is a lot of noise.
So much. Think about it. These patients are pumped full of heavy sedatives, painkillers, adrenaline. They are suffering from massive physical trauma. How do we know they aren't just experiencing generalized ICU delirium or some drug-induced hallucination?
That's the main critique, usually.
Right. So for a long time, the gold standard was the Grayson scale, which was developed back in 1983 by psychiatrist Dr. Bruce Grayson. It used a 16-item questionnaire to identify genuine NDEs.
And it was super groundbreaking for its time. But clinical research has obviously evolved dramatically, and we needed a much sharper tool.
Right.
Which brings us to a major breakthrough that culminated in recent validations, the Near-Death Experience Content Scale, or the NDEC scale.
Right.
This was finalized in the early 2020s and rigorously tested through 2025. It was basically designed to quantify the NDE in a much more complete, mathematically sound way.
The NDEC uses 20 specific items broken down into 5 core factors. So you have temporality, which measures changes in the perception of time or how fast thoughts are moving. Harmony, measuring feelings of profound peace, joy, and unity with the universe.
Right.
Beyond senses, which captures the out-of-body experiences and verified perceptions of the physical world. Gateway, so the sensation of the tunnel, the light, or a border. And insight, which covers the life review and that sudden feeling of profound universal understanding.
It covers all the bases.
Yeah, and they score the whole thing out of 80 points. To officially qualify as a true classical NDE in modern clinical research, a patient actually has to hit a strict cutoff score of 27 out of 80.
And this isn't just theoretical modeling. The scale was put to an absolutely massive test in a 2025 study out of Denmark led by a researcher named Tobias Ankerstrup.
Right, the Danish study.
Yeah, his team validated this exact scale on a huge cohort of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest survivors. They meticulously pulled data from the Danish Cardiac Arrest Register over a 4-year period. Out of hundreds of survivors who reported returning with memories of their unconscious state, they applied the NDEC scale. And the statistical results were just incredible. The scale showed a 0.92 Cronbach's alpha.
Okay, let me just jump in here to translate that for anyone who, doesn't spend their weekends reading statistical methodology textbooks.
Please do.
Cronbach's alpha is basically a measure of internal consistency. Imagine you create a test to measure depression. If someone is truly depressed, they should score highly on all the questions related to depression.
Right.
If they score high on some questions but low on others just seemingly at random, your test is poorly designed. It's a warped ruler. A 0.92 Cronbach's alpha is extraordinarily high. It means this ruler is incredibly reliable. It proves that the psychological architecture of an NDE is identical across wildly different patients.
Exactly. And this is the crucial point for the listener to grasp. A drug hallucination is chaotic. If you give 10 people LSD or heavy ICU sedatives, you are going to get 10 completely different, bizarre, disjointed trips.
You're chaos.
Yeah. But if you look at the NDEC data, thousands of people across different continents, speaking different languages, suffering entirely different medical emergencies, are reporting the exact same highly structured experience. When you see a 0.92 internal consistency in any other field of science, it points to an objective, measurable phenomenon.
Yeah.
This is not just the random neurological noise of a dying brain.
But okay, let me push back on the very premise of the scale for a sec.
Sure.
Is applying a numerical score to an experience this ineffable, this transcendent, kind of missing the point entirely? It feels a little bit like trying to measure the emotional devastation of a heartbreak with a thermometer.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Or measuring the beauty of a Mozart symphony with a plastic ruler. I mean, you can measure the frequency of the sound waves in the room, sure, but does a score of 27 out of 80 actually capture the profound, soul-altering reality these patients are describing?
I think your Mozart analogy is actually perfect, but I'd look at it from a slightly different angle.
Okay.
You're right. The ruler absolutely cannot capture the sweeping emotion or the majesty of the symphony. But what the ruler does do is prove mathematically that the symphony actually occurred in a highly specific, repeatable, and organized pattern.
Okay, I see what you mean.
It proves that the music wasn't just random static on the radio. And for decades, the entrenched medical establishment has aggressively insisted that NDEs were just random static.
Just noise.
Right, they argued it was just the chaotic, meaningless misfiring of a brain starving for oxygen. The NDEC scale proves the static is actually a highly complex symphony.
Which perfectly sets up the massive biological debate, because traditional neuroscience has absolutely not been sitting quietly on the sidelines here.
No, not at all.
For years, there has been this relentless, deeply funded attempt to find the exact biological mechanism, like the specific gears and levers in the brain that generate these experiences. And in 2025, that effort culminated in what was presented as the ultimate, definitive materialist explanation, the Neptune model.
Ah, Neptune. It stands for Neurophysiological Evolutionary Psychological Theory Understanding Near-Death Experience. That is quite a mouthful.
It really is.
It was published as a major neurology journal, and it was basically the materialist scientific community throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at the problem. They attempted to bundle every single physical explanation into one grand unified theory to just close the book on NDEs once and for all.
So let's look at the ingredients of this biological cocktail they proposed.
Please do it.
The Neptune model argued that NDEs are the combined result of hypoxia, which is oxygen deprivation, hypercapnia, which is a massive buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood, temporal lobe seizures triggered by cellular stress, the intrusion of REM sleep states into waking consciousness, a massive, desperate flood of endogenous endorphins and ketamine-like neurochemicals, and finally, a surge of dying brain electrical spikes captured on EEGs.
And, on paper, to a layperson, that sounds like a very impressive, highly scientific list.
Yeah.
The authors really presented it as case closed, the mystery is solved, it's just brain chemistry breaking down.
Right.
But then, in October 2025, Dr. Bruce Grayson and Marietta Pelivanova from the University of Virginia published a devastating point-by-point rebuttal in the journal Psychology of Consciousness.
Wow.
And when I say devastating, I mean they systematically dismantled the Neptune model piece by piece using real clinical data.
Let's do exactly that. Let's walk through their rebuttals, starting with the most common explanation people jump to: hypoxia.
Yeah, oxygen deprivation.
The assumption makes intuitive sense, right? The brain uses 20% of the body's oxygen. When the heart stops, the oxygen supply stops. The brain cells start to suffocate, ion channels fail, and the brain hallucinates. Simple, right?
Simple, but clinically false. Grayson and Pilavanova pointed out that we actually know exactly what hypoxia looks like in a clinical setting.
Right, it's not a mystery.
Exactly. Think of fighter pilots experiencing G-force, or climbers at extremely high altitudes, or patients literally suffocating. Hypoxia consistently causes intense confusion, disorientation, severe amnesia, and highly fragmented, disjointed thoughts. It degrades cognitive function, it does not enhance it.
Right, it's like if your computer processor is losing power, it doesn't suddenly run a hyper-complex 4K resolution virtual reality simulation flawlessly.
No, it stutters and crashes.
It glitches out.
Precisely. Anyone who has treated a hypoxic patient in an emergency room knows they are agitated and completely lacking lucidity. But NDEs are the exact opposite.
Hyperlucid.
Yes. Patients consistently report that their thoughts were clearer, faster, and more rational than at any point in their normal waking lives. Furthermore, and this is kind of the nail in the coffin for the hypoxia theory, blood gas analyses taken during cardiac arrests show no correlation.
Wait, really? No correlation at all?
None. Some patients who reported profound NDEs had normal or even higher than average blood oxygen levels compared to cardiac arrest patients who reported absolutely nothing. The data simply contradicts the theory.
Okay, well, what about hypercapnia, the buildup of carbon dioxide? We know CO2 dilates blood vessels in the brain and can alter consciousness.
Same issue, really. Elevated CO2 levels in the blood do not produce structured, hyper-real, life-transforming visions. They produce sluggishness, coma, and sometimes panic.
All right, let's move to the temporal lobe seizure argument, because the temporal lobe is often referred to as the brain's hard drive.
Right.
It plays a massive role in processing memory, emotion, and our perception of time. So the Neptune model suggests that as the brain dies, the temporal lobe experiences this chaotic electrical seizure, which just dumps a lifetime of memories into the conscious mind, creating the life review and the distortion of time.
And that sounds incredibly plausible until you actually look at the data from epilepsy patients.
Which Grayson did.
Yes. He cited the work of Dr. Ernst Rodin, who is a highly respected epileptologist. Rodin systematically studied over 100 patients suffering from severe temporal lobe seizures. Out of those 100 patients, how many reported anything even remotely resembling the peace, structure, and transcendence of an NDE?
I'm guessing it's a low number.
0.
0. That is a powerful statistic.
Exactly. Temporal lobe seizures are clinically terrifying for the patient. They're chaotic, bizarre, and fragmented. They often involve smelling burning rubber, feeling a profound sense of impending doom, or experiencing chaotic, frightening visual flashes.
That sounds awful.
It is. They do not produce a serene, chronologically ordered, deeply moral review of one's entire life, accompanied by a feeling of universal love. The phenomenological profiles are just completely different.
Okay, then we have the REM sleep intrusion theory. This is the idea that the brainstem, under the extreme stress of dying, essentially short circuits and flips the brain into a paradoxical dream state while the patient is technically awake or semi-conscious.
But again, think about what happens when REM sleep intrudes into waking consciousness in normal life. It's called sleep paralysis.
Oh, which is terrifying.
Exactly. It is almost universally accompanied by a sense of absolute, suffocating terror. People feel paralyzed, they feel a heavy weight on their chest, and they frequently hallucinate malevolent shadow figures or demons in the room.
Right.
This is the complete opposite of the profound liberating peace and the benevolent luminous entities reported in NDEs. Moreover, generating the complex neurological architecture of REM sleep requires a significant amount of electrical energy.
And during cardiac arrest.
During a full cardiac arrest, the brain's electrical activity is so profoundly suppressed, so utterly flat, that it literally lacks the metabolic power to even generate a REM state.
I want to touch on the chemical aspect too, specifically the ketamine theory, because this one had a lot of traction for a really long time.
It really did.
Dr. Carl Jansen was a major pioneer in this. He hypothesized that the brain has this evolved protective mechanism. So when it senses catastrophic, unsurvivable physical trauma, it just floods the system with endogenous ketamine or DMT to cushion the psyche from the sheer terror of dying.
Like a built-in painkiller for the soul.
Exactly. It essentially gives you a massive psychedelic trip to ease you out of the door.
And Jansen wrote extensively on this. And it's true. Ketamine does block NMDA receptors in the brain, which can cause a dissociative state. People on ketamine often report feeling detached from their bodies or floating. But the story takes a fascinating turn. After years of championing this theory, Jansen actually abandoned it.
Wait, why did he walk away from his own life's work? That's huge.
Because of the psychological aftermath. A ketamine trip might mimic the very superficial initial feeling of dissociation, but it completely lacks the deep narrative reality of a true NDE.
Right, drug trips are messy.
Highly variable and often very confusing. But more importantly, if you look at the life change inventory, which is a psychological tool used to measure long-term behavioral shifts, drug trips do not produce permanent radical transformations.
Oh, that makes sense.
You don't take a recreational dose of ketamine and wake up with a permanent total loss of your fear of death, a newfound, profound sense of universal empathy, and a sudden desire to quit your high-paying corporate job to become a hospice nurse.
Right, you just have a hangover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
NDEs routinely produce these permanent psychological overhauls. A chemical dump simply cannot explain the profound lasting integration of the experience.
Okay, I see your point about the aftermath, but I really have to step in and defend the biological perspective here for a moment.
Go for it.
Because even if the Neptune model is flawed, even if the authors, overreached by bundling weak arguments together, we cannot underestimate the sheer brilliance of the human brain as an evolved survival machine.
Fair point.
Consider the biological concept of thanatosis, or death feigning.
Basically playing possum.
Right. And we see it across the entire animal kingdom. When an animal is cornered, trapped, and a violent death is absolutely imminent, the brain triggers a massive, instantaneous physiological shift. It completely shuts down the sympathetic nervous system's fight-or-flight response.
It just gives up the fight.
It induces temporary paralysis, slows the heart rate to an undetectable crawl, and floods the system with calming neurochemicals to numb the pain of being eaten. From an evolutionary standpoint, isn't it highly probable that the near-death experience is simply the human brain's hyper-advanced cognitive version of thanatosis?
That's an interesting parallel.
Right. When the physical trauma becomes just too great, the brain deploys a deeply embedded evolutionary simulation. It projects a peaceful tunnel and a comforting life review to soothe the conscious mind as the biological hardware permanently shuts down. It's an elegant, deeply protective mechanism.
It is an incredibly elegant theory, I'll give you that. And it shows how desperately the biological sciences want to keep consciousness localized to the brain.
Well, yeah.
But think about the Neptune model and the thanatosis theory by extension, like a ship captain trying to fix a sinking vessel by duct taping 6 leaky buckets together.
Leaky bucket?
Yeah, tying together half a dozen inadequate, flawed explanations, hypoxia, seizures, worm intrusion, chemical dumps. It doesn't suddenly synthesize into one cohesive, strong scientific theory. They're bundling excuses that individually directly contradict the observed clinical data of lucidity, verifiable perceptions, and flat EGs.
I hear your leaky bucket analogy, but as an analytical thinker, I have to say, just because the puzzle pieces of neurobiology don't perfectly snap together right now today, doesn't mean we should throw the entire puzzle box in the trash.
I'm not saying throw it away.
We are dealing with an organ containing 86 billion neurons in a state of utter metabolic crisis. Our functional MRI machines and EEGs are incredible, but they are still relatively blunt instruments. We shouldn't jump entirely out of the realm of biology and physics just because we haven't found the exact chemical trigger yet.
And I would completely agree with your caution there.
Yeah.
I really would. If we were only talking about internal subjective visions of light and tunnels, I would say, sure, keep searching the brain for the chemical trigger.
But we aren't just talking about that.
No, we aren't. Because there is one massive, undeniable, rigorously documented anomaly that completely shatters the biological puzzle box. An anomaly that neuroscience simply cannot answer.
And what's that?
It's the phenomenon of veridical near-death experiences.
Oh, right. This is where the debate shifts from fascinating to deeply uncomfortable for strict materialists.
Very uncomfortable.
Let's define this clearly for the listener. A veridical NDE or VPNDE, refers to a specific type of case where a patient is clinically dead, their brain waves are utterly flat, their eyes are closed, and yet, during the reported out-of-body experience, they perceive real-world, highly specific, verifiable details.
Right, things they can actually prove later.
Yes. They see and hear things occurring in the room or even in other rooms entirely that they could not possibly have guessed or hallucinated.
And because this specific data point is so incredibly disruptive to the traditional scientific worldview, researchers couldn't just rely on loose storytelling. They actually developed the VNDE scale, the Veridical Near-Death Experience scale.
Oh, another scale.
Yeah, it's a new, highly structured analytical tool developed by a consortium of international experts. It systematically rates the evidential strength of these impossible perceptions.
So what are they measuring exactly?
The scale looks at the exact timing of the cardiac arrest, the physical state of the patient's sensory organs, the quality and independence of the third-party verification, and whether there is any possible physical explanation, like sensory leakage, for how the patient knew the information.
And the methodology has become so strict that in recent years, they are even utilizing artificial intelligence to remove human bias from the scoring, right?
Oh, right.
Researchers are feeding the raw medical case reports into large language models like ChatGPT-4 and having the AI rate the evidential strength alongside human experts to ensure the researchers aren't, subconsciously favoring the paranormal explanation.
Which is brilliant.
And the results of these veridical studies are genuinely staggering. Dr. Jan Holden, a prominent researcher in this field, conducted an exhaustive study analyzing out-of-body observations made during NDEs. She found that an astonishing 92% of the highly specific details patients recalled about their surroundings while they were clinically dead were completely, perfectly accurate when verified by the medical staff.
Let that number just sink in for a second. 92%.
It's huge.
That fundamentally rules out hallucination. A hallucination is, by definition, the brain misfiring and generating a false reality. It makes things up. A hallucinating brain does not produce a highly accurate, flawlessly detailed, third-party verified rendering of a chaotic, fast-moving emergency room.
Right.
To truly understand how baffling this is, we have to look at the undisputed gold standard of veridical cases, the case of Pam Reynolds.
Oh, Pam Reynolds. For anyone in neurosurgical circles, this case is legendary.
It really is.
It is the ultimate test of the biological model. So Pam had a giant arterial aneurysm located incredibly deep inside her brainstem. It was essentially a ticking time bomb.
Very dangerous.
To operate safely without the aneurysm bursting and killing her instantly, her surgical team, led by a brilliant neurosurgeon named Dr. Robert Spetzler, they had to utilize an extreme procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest.
In the medical field, they casually refer to it as standstill surgery.
Yeah.
Because everything literally stands still.
Exactly. I want to walk the listener step by step through what they did to this woman's body because the physiological state she was in is so crucial here.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, they put her on a cardiopulmonary bypass machine. Then they artificially cooled her body temperature down to 15 degrees Celsius, which is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit.
So cold.
At this temperature, the metabolic rate of the brain drops so low that the cells don't immediately die when starved of oxygen. Once she was cooled, they chemically stopped her heart. They stopped her breathing. And then they physically tipped the operating table and drained the blood out of her head.
They trained it.
Yes, her brain was completely, utterly devoid of blood and oxygen. Her EEG, which measures the electrical firing of the cerebral cortex, was a totally flat line. Her brainstem, which controls primitive reflexes, was completely unresponsive.
And Dr. Spetzler's team went even further to monitor her. To ensure there was absolutely no brainstem activity, they placed these molded earpieces deep into her ear canals.
Right, the clickers.
Yeah, these earpieces were blasting 100 decibel clicks, which is about the volume of a roaring lawnmower or a jackhammer, directly into her ears. They used this to measure auditory evoked potentials. If the brainstem is alive, it registers a tiny electrical spike in response to the click. Pam's brainstem registered absolutely nothing.
Totally flat.
Totally flat. Furthermore, her eyes were lubricated and securely taped shut to prevent damage. So, by every single definition known to medical science, Pam Reynolds was a corpse on that operating table. She possessed zero neurological hardware capable of forming a memory or processing any sensory input.
And yet, after the aneurysm was successfully repaired, the blood was pumped back in, and she was slowly brought back to life, she woke up and reported this incredibly detailed out-of-body experience.
So,
She reported floating up out of her physical body and looking down over the surgeon's shoulder. She described the specific surgical bone saw Dr. Spetzler used to cut her skull. Now, she didn't just say they used a saw. She specifically noted that the instrument didn't look like a traditional medical saw.
right, the details were wild.
Yeah. She described it as looking exactly like an electric toothbrush or a pneumatic drill. She noted that the sterile blades were kept in a specific kind of customized carrying case, and she described how the tool had interchangeable tips.
Which is so specific.
And she had never, ever seen this instrument before the surgery. In standard operating procedure, these tools are kept covered in sterile packaging on a tray until the patient is fully anesthetized and draped. She had zero visual access to this prior to going under.
The visual details are astounding, sure, but the auditory details completely break the biological model.
Oh, because of the clicks.
Yes. Remember, she has 100 decibel clicks blasting directly into her ear canals, and her auditory cortex is flatlined. Yet, she accurately recalled a specific, highly technical conversation occurring between the surgeons.
Yeah.
She reported hearing the female cardiovascular surgeon comment that Pam's blood vessels in her right groin were incredibly small, making it difficult to insert the bypass tubes. She then heard Dr. Spetzler reply, telling the surgeon to try the other side. Everything she reported, the tools, the dialogue, the exact sequence of events, was perfectly verified by the surgical records and the staff.
It is an incredibly robust case, but it's not the only one. There are cases that push the boundaries even further into the impossible.
Tell me about it.
Let's look at the case documented by Dr. Aufderheide, a professor of emergency medicine. He was a young attending physician at the time, managing an elderly patient who was having just a horrific night. The patient kept going into full cardiac arrest over and over again.
Repeatedly crashing.
Yeah, the medical team would rush in, perform CPR, shock him with the defibrillator, get a pulse back, and then minutes later, his heart would stop again. Throughout this entire ordeal, the patient was deeply unconscious, his eyes were closed, and he was repeatedly flatlining.
Days later, when the patient finally stabilized and regained consciousness in the ICU, he asked Dr. Aufderheide to come into his room. He told the doctor that while he was dead, he was floating above the room, and he listed 3 specific things he observed. First, he correctly noted that the doctor had stepped out of the room into the hallway to give the patient's family a highly pessimistic update on his chances of survival.
Which is verifiable.
Right. Second, he looked at the doctor and said, "You ate my lunch."
Wait, what?
Yeah, which was incredibly specific and entirely true. In the middle of the night, during a brief lull in the chaos, a starving, exhausted Dr. Aufderheide had actually eaten the unconscious patient's untouched hospital tray.
That's hilarious, but also amazing.
But the third point is what truly defies physical reality.
Okay, brace me.
The patient looked at the doctor and said, "While you were eating my lunch, you felt incredibly sorry for yourself because the senior physician had gone to sleep in the break room and left you all alone to deal with me."
Oh my God.
Dr. Aufderheide was absolutely terrified by this statement. Why? Because he had never spoken that frustration out loud. He hadn't muttered it under his breath. It was a purely internal, private thought of a stressed-out young doctor.
So he read his mind.
The patient, while his heart was stopped and his brain was deprived of oxygen, essentially read the doctor's mind.
It moves way beyond simple visual observation into literal telepathy. And if we want to talk about perceptions that completely defy physical boundaries and geography, we must talk about the case of Katie.
Oh, the Katie case.
Yes, this case was documented by Dr. Melvin Morse, who was historically a highly skeptical materialist pediatrician. Katie was a young girl, about 9 years old, who tragically drowned in a swimming pool. She was pulled out, CPR was performed, and she arrived at the hospital emergency room completely comatose.
Just a heartbreaking situation.
Truly, her lungs had collapsed, she had no gag reflex, and her pupils were fixed and dilated. She had perhaps a 10% chance of surviving the night.
Against all odds, though, she miraculously survived and recovered.
Right.
A few days later, Dr. Morse gently interviewed her. He was trying to figure out neurologically how long she had been underwater without oxygen. But Katie interrupted him and asked if he wanted to know what she did while she was out of her body. She calmly explained that after she left her drowning body, she was met by a luminous, comforting woman named Elizabeth. But Katie wasn't ready to go into the light yet. She wanted to go see her family.
Oh, this is the remote viewing part.
Exactly. So while her physical body lay comatose and dying in the ICU, surrounded by doctors, her consciousness supposedly traveled miles away to her family's home.
And what she described to Dr. Morse was chillingly accurate.
Beyond accurate. She described exactly what her family members were doing at that specific moment in time. She saw her younger brother pushing a very specific G.I. Joe action figure around on a toy military jeep.
Okay, that's specific.
She saw her older sister sitting in her room combing a Barbie doll's hair while singing along to a very specific popular rock song playing on the radio. She described her mother in the kitchen cooking a meal of roast chicken and rice.
So specific.
And she described her father, overwhelmed with grief, just sitting motionless on the living room sofa, staring blankly ahead. Dr. Morse, being a skeptic, meticulously verified every single one of these hyper-specific details with the parents. They confirmed that every detail, the toys, the song, the dinner, was exactly correct for that exact time window.
Okay, let me just stop you there. Because I have to put my analytical hat back on, because this is the absolute crux of the entire debate. I agree these cases are utterly mind-bending, but as a scientist, I have to vigorously question the timeline of memory encoding.
Sure, what here?
We know for a fact that the brain is highly vulnerable and unpredictable when it is waking up from heavy anesthesia or a deep coma. In that split second of regaining consciousness as the auditory cortex slowly comes back online, isn't it entirely possible that the brain subconsciously absorbs subtle auditory cues from the environment?
You're talking about sensory leakage.
Yes, sensory leakage. Let's apply it to Pam Reynolds, for instance. Could it be that she heard the staff talking about the pneumatic saw? Or complaining about her small arteries while she was waking up hours later in the recovery room?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Or perhaps her auditory cortex processed the surgeon's voices just as the anesthesia was wearing off, and her highly stressed brain retroactively constructed a visual hallucination like an out-of-body dream to make narrative sense of the audio she heard.
The retroactive construction theory. It is the most common defense used by skeptics, and it's a totally valid hypothesis to test. But it completely falls apart when you look at the visual details of the Reynolds case.
How so?
She didn't just hear the word saw and imagine a standard medical tool. She accurately described the physical shape of the tool like a pneumatic drill and the specific customized carrying case with interchangeable blades. Those are visual details she could not possibly derive from simply hearing a voice. Furthermore, auditory leakage cannot explain Dr. Ofterheid's patient knowing an unvoiced internal thought. You can't subconsciously hear a thought that was never spoken.
Yeah, I will concede that point. The telepathy case, and certainly Katie's remote viewing of her family miles away in another zip code, completely defy any standard sensory leakage explanations. I cannot build a biological anatomical model for a comatose child whose eyes are closed in an ICU suddenly seeing what's for dinner at her house across town.
It's because you are trying to fit the data into a model that says the brain creates consciousness.
Well, what's the alternative?
Think about it using a different paradigm. Imagine you are sitting in your living room watching your absolute favorite show on a television set. Suddenly, someone walks in with a baseball bat and violently smashes the TV to pieces. The screen shatters, the wires are cut, the hardware is completely destroyed, the screen goes dark. Does the television broadcast the invisible signal carrying the show stop existing just because the TV is broken?
No, I mean, the signal's still out there.
Exactly. The signal is still flying through the air, completely intact. The television was merely the receiver. It was the biological hardware tuning into the broadcast, not the creator of the show. When the brain shuts down due to trauma or cardiac arrest, the consciousness, the broadcast, is simply freed from the broken receiver. It is no longer localized to the skull, it expands, which is why Katie can view her house and the elderly patient can read a thought.
Okay, I appreciate the elegance of the brain as antenna analogy. It neatly, almost too neatly, solves the problem.
Right.
But as someone trained in the scientific method, I have to insist that until we have an instrument like a literal mechanism to measure that invisible broadcast signal without the TV set, science must keep searching for the hidden wires. We can't just throw up our hands, declare the brain a receiver, and say it's magic.
It isn't magic, though. It is simply physics and non-local geometry that we do not fully understand yet. And if you want cases that definitively, aggressively rule out any possibility of hidden wires, sensory leakage, or retroactive brain construction, we have to look at the groundbreaking research of John Burke and the phenomenon of the blind from birth.
Oh, wow, yes. This is arguably the most challenging data set for traditional neurobiology to answer.
Absolutely.
John Burke is an engineer turned researcher. He brought a strict analytical mathematical methodology to thousands of NDE case studies, and he heavily focused his research on a very specific demographic: patients who were congenitally blind, meaning they were born entirely without sight.
This is a massive crucial distinction, because if you are born blind, your brain has never, not once, processed a single photon of light. Your visual cortex has no neural wiring for sight. Because of neuroplasticity, that part of your brain has likely been repurposed for hearing or touch. You do not have a subconscious library of visual memories to draw from. When congenitally blind people dream, they do not dream in pictures. They dream entirely in sounds, smells, and tactile sensations.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It is. So from a purely biological materialist standpoint, a congenitally blind brain physically lacks the raw material and the neural architecture to generate a visual hallucination.
Burke documented several of these cases, but the most famous is a woman named Vicky. Vicky was born completely blind. As an adult, she was involved in a severe car accident and rushed to the hospital. During her emergency surgery, she suffered a cardiac arrest. Her heart stopped, and she reported leaving her body and moving up to the ceiling of the operating room. And for the very first time in her entire existence, she experienced visual perception.
It is genuinely hard to fathom what that must have been like for her.
I know. She saw the chaotic scene unfolding below her. She saw her own physical body lying on the operating table, and she realized what it was. She recognized the specific resuscitation tools the doctors were using, and she perceived the world in full, vibrant, three-dimensional visual space.
And here's the undeniable kicker. As soon as the medical team restarted her heart and her consciousness was slammed back into her physical body, she instantly returned to total, pitch-black blindness. She has remained blind ever since.
It's just wild.
I pose this question to the materialist model. If an NDE is just the brain's neurochemicals firing off random stored memories as it dies, how does a blind brain randomly fire off a perfect, highly accurate 3D visual reconstruction of a hospital room it has never possessed the capability to see?
You can't.
Right. A computer cannot render a high-definition 4K video if it doesn't possess a graphics card.
It's a fantastic, deeply troubling question for biology. And it ties into another highly anomalous category of experiences called peak Nderian cases. These are typically deathbed visions that occur as someone is slowly dying rather than sudden cardiac arrests, but they share the exact same phenomenological structure.
The name is wonderfully poetic. It comes from an old poem about explorers standing on a peak in Darien, Panama, looking out over the landscape and suddenly discovering an entirely new, vast ocean they didn't know existed.
I love that.
In NDE research, it refers to cases where a dying person looks into the afterlife and sees something they couldn't possibly know. Specifically, they encounter a deceased person they believed was still alive.
The classic foundational example of this was documented by Sir William Barrett, a prominent physicist. His wife, who was a physician, was caring for a young woman who was dying shortly after childbirth.
Such a sad situation.
Yeah. As the woman was passing away, her panic subsided. She became incredibly peaceful, and she reported seeing a beautiful, welcoming light. She then said her deceased father was walking toward her. Now, a skeptic would immediately say, sure, her dying brain is simply projecting a comforting image of her father from her memory bank to soothe her anxiety.
A perfectly reasonable biological assumption. But then it gets weird.
Very weird. The dying woman, looking into this light, suddenly looked shocked and said, oh, Vida is with him. Vida was her beloved sister. The massive problem with this vision, Vida had died unexpectedly from an illness 3 weeks prior.
Oh, wow.
But because the dying woman was in such a fragile state after childbirth, the family had explicitly, carefully kept Veda's death a total secret from her. They didn't want to cause her additional emotional distress that might kill her.
This completely destroys the expectation-based hallucination theory. If the woman's brain was generating a comforting, subjective hallucination based on her memories and expectations, it would absolutely not have projected her living sister as a spirit residing in the afterlife.
Yeah.
Her brain fully believed Vida was alive and well. The vision contained objective, veridical information, the secret death of her sister that she cognitively did not possess.
Which brings us to a point where the timeline of reality itself seems to warp and bend. We see precognitive elements in these phenomena where people access information from the future. Even the famously skeptical American author Mark Twain, a man who relentlessly mocked spiritualism, had an experience that profoundly haunted him.
Yes, Mark Twain, a massive cynic. When he was a young man, he and his younger brother Henry were working as riverboat pilots on the Mississippi. One night, Mark had a hyper-vivid, highly unusual dream that felt more real than waking life.
Go ahead.
He saw his brother Henry lying dead in a metallic coffin. Now, context is important here. At the time, metallic coffins were incredibly rare and extremely expensive. Most common people were buried in cheap pine boxes. In the dream, Henry was wearing one of Mark's specific suits, and resting on his chest was a bouquet of white flowers with a single, highly specific red rose in the exact center.
Twain woke up completely shaken. The dream was so visceral, he thought it was real for a few moments. Days later, Henry was working on the steamboat Pennsylvania when the ship's massive boilers exploded.
Tragic.
He was horribly burned and suffered in agony for a few days before he died. When Mark Twain arrived at the makeshift morgue to identify the body, he walked into a scene that completely froze his blood. Some wealthy ladies in the town, deeply moved by Henry's youth and tragic death, had pooled their money to buy him a rare, expensive metallic coffin. And because Henry's clothes had been burned off, someone had secretly borrowed one of Mark's suits to dress the body.
The scene was a perfect, impossible match for the dream, minus the flowers. But as Mark Twain stood there in shock, a woman walked into the room, approached the coffin, and silently laid a bouquet of white flowers with a single red rose directly on Henry's chest.
It gives me chills.
This wasn't a vague feeling of déjà vu. This was a high-definition photographic rendering of the future that materialized down to the exact flower and the specific metal casing of the coffin.
So how do we conceptualize this? If human consciousness can see without eyes, if it can know secrets it was never told, and if it can view a highly specific future before the physics of time have played out, what kind of universe are we actually living in? John Burke, the researcher who studied the blind patients, offered a really fascinating geometric analogy to help us wrap our three-dimensional minds around this.
The 2D versus 3D analogy. I absolutely love this conceptual model. Burke says, imagine that our entire physical reality, everything we can touch, see, and measure, is just a flat, two-dimensional piece of paper.
Okay, a flat page.
We're like 2D stick figures drawn in ink on this paper. We can only go left, right, forward, and backward across the page. We have absolutely no concept of the directions up or down lifting off the page. We don't even have the sensory organs to perceive the massive, infinite 3D space hovering mere inches above our flat world.
But at the moment of clinical death, Burke argues, the ink is loosened. Our consciousness is literally peeled off that 2D paper and lifted into the pre-existing higher dimensional 3D space. Suddenly, you look down and you can see the entire flat world all at once. You can see your own physical body on the operating table from above. You can see through walls into the next room because walls only exist as lines on the flat paper. From above, you can see inside all the boxes.
It makes so much sense.
This perfectly explains why NDers constantly, universally say that the afterlife feels more real or more 3D than our world, and why they struggle so much to describe it using our limited 2D vocabulary.
It's exactly like trying to explain the vibrant, shifting colors of a sunset to a stick figure who has only ever known black ink. The language simply doesn't exist to convey the data.
It's a beautiful model. But, as always, scientific rigor demands we look at the counterarguments. In March 2026, a researcher named Rekha Kaish published a brand new, highly sophisticated theory in the journal Frontiers in Psychology.
Right.
It's called the dying moment dream hypothesis. And it is a brilliant, modernized attempt to ground all of this physics-defying data back into the neurobiology of the brain.
I'm familiar with Kai's work. What is the core mechanical argument of this new hypothesis?
Kaish focuses on time perception. He argues that under massive hypoxic stress, when the brain is starving for oxygen, the brain's temporal processing network completely collapses. Think about how time works in a normal REM sleep dream. You can live out days, weeks, or even a lifetime of a complex storyline in a dream, but when you wake up, the clock says you've only been asleep for 20 minutes.
Time is totally fluid in dreams.
Right. Time is not a fixed universal constant. It is a construct generated by the brain. Kaish proposes that in the dying moments, as those specific neural networks fail, subjective time dilates to infinity. Imagine a computer processor freezing right as a heavy, graphics-intensive video game is rendering. The screen locks on one hyper-vivid frame, and to the character inside the game, that split-second freeze lasts for an eternity.
So he's suggesting that an entire sweeping afterlife is experienced in a microsecond of biological time.
Exactly. The brain, panicking as it shuts down, frantically compiles your deepest memories, your cultural expectations, your religious beliefs, and your unresolved emotions into one final, inescapable, hyperlucid simulation. A literal ultimate dream.
A final massive download.
Yeah, and because the patient never wakes up, or if they are resuscitated, they wake up hours later in the ICU, that final dilated simulation becomes their permanent, subjective reality of the event. It neatly explains why a Christian might see Jesus, while a Hindu might see Yamaraj, the god of death. The brain is rendering the simulation using the person's own specific cultural vocabulary.
It's a very clever, mathematically intriguing hypothesis. But I have to challenge the dying dream theory using the exact same data point we used before, the blind patients. I point back to Vicky. A brain that has never, ever processed a photon of light cannot suddenly simulate an accurate 3D visual field of a hospital room, complete with accurate details of resuscitation tools. A collapsing temporal network might distort time, but it cannot create sensory data out of thin air. The 2D peeling analogy consciousness actually leaving the body fits the veridical verified data significantly better than the internal dream hypothesis.
Let me push back heavily on the peeling analogy, though. If this vast, hyper-real 3D space is always around us, constantly humming with universal consciousness, why does it take massive physical trauma like a heart attack, a ruptured aneurysm, or a horrific car crash to peel us off the paper? Why are we stuck to the 2D page at all?
That's the big question.
I would argue that perhaps the brain acts as a necessary, heavy biological anchor for consciousness, and physical trauma simply loosens the tether.
That is a profound philosophical thought, but it has scientific merit too. The brain as a tether, or a reducing valve, it keeps our massive consciousness grounded and restricted to this specific narrow sliver of space-time so we can actually function and survive biologically.
Right.
If we were constantly tapped into the infinite 3D reality, sensing the interconnectedness of all things across time, we'd never remember to eat, reproduce, or run from a predator. The brain limits us so we can survive.
Which naturally moves us into the final frontier of this debate, quantum mechanics and the future of consciousness. Because if classical biology, like the Neptune model and the time dilation dream, cannot explain veridical perception, and we want to remain scientific rather than purely mystical, frontier physics might offer the bridge we need.
This is where the science gets truly mind-bending, because we have to leave classical Newtonian physics behind. For decades, the renowned physicist Sir Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have championed a theory called the Orchestrated Objective Reduction Model, or ORC. Right. They propose that consciousness is not created by the simple chemical firing of synapses in the brain, but rather by quantum vibrations occurring inside structures called microtubules.
Let's break down what a microtubule actually is for the listener, so we aren't just throwing around jargon. Think of a microtubule like the physical scaffolding of a building. Inside a single brain cell, a neuron, these microscopic tubes provide structure. They are made of lattice-like proteins.
Right, the architecture.
Penrose and Hameroff argue that the specific geometry of this lattice can maintain quantum coherence, meaning particles can exist in multiple states at once, like a biological quantum computer inside the warm, wet environment of the brain.
Correct. And under extreme physical stress, like a cardiac arrest, the blood flow stops, the brain loses its metabolic energy, and the neurons fail. But according to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be destroyed.
Right.
The quantum information, the consciousness residing inside those microtubules, isn't destroyed when the biological cell dies. It unbinds from the failing physical structure and dissipates into the universe at large, existing non-locally.
So if the patient is resuscitated, that quantum information is drawn back into the microtubules, the system reboots, and the patient opens their eyes and says, "I was outside my body floating near the ceiling." If the patient isn't revived, that quantum information remains in the universe forever, functioning essentially as what religion has always called a soul.
Precisely. And then you have Dr. Robert Lanza, a brilliant stem cell researcher, pushing the physics even further with his theory of biocentrism. He argues that our entire current model of reality has it fundamentally backward. Standard science thinks the physical universe existed for billions of years, eventually created biological life, which then randomly evolved consciousness. Lanza proposes the exact opposite. Consciousness is the fundamental base building block of reality. He argues that space and time are literally just illusions. They are mental constructs generated by the mind to organize sensory information.
It's the ultimate matrix theory.
I naturally gravitate toward these quantum interpretations because if space and time are just illusions generated by our biological software, then precognition, like Mark Twain dreaming the exact details of the future, and remote viewing, like Katie seeing her family miles away, are no longer impossible magic tricks.
They're just features of the system.
Exactly. They are simply the raw, unfiltered consciousness accessing the broader holographic data of the universe once the biological filter, the brain, drops offline. The tether is cut, and you have instant access to the entire network.
I remain the voice of scientific caution here. I deeply appreciate the mathematical beauty of the quantum models, and I love the conceptual elegance of microtubules acting as quantum antennas, tuning into a universal consciousness. But we have to acknowledge they are highly, highly speculative.
That's fair.
We cannot currently put a dying brain into a scanner and measure quantum consciousness unbinding and floating out of the skull.
I admit the empirical measurement of the unbinding is still totally beyond our current technology.
However, what I can fully acknowledge and what is empirically measured by psychiatrists and sociologists all over the world are the very real physical and psychological changes in these patients. Whether they actually experienced a quantum shift into a higher dimensional holographic universe, or they underwent the ultimate time-dilated neurochemical dying dream, the effect of the experience on the human being is profoundly, undeniably real.
The after effects are arguably the most important grounding part of the whole phenomenon. We can debate physics all day, but we can't debate the psychological outcomes.
Exactly. People come back from NDEs and they are fundamentally, permanently changed at their core. They report a complete and total loss of the fear of death. They exhibit significantly increased compassion, empathy, and patience.
They're just better people.
They really are. They often completely abandon materialistic pursuits. You routinely see cutthroat corporate executives survive a heart attack, experience an NDE, and promptly quit their lucrative jobs to become teachers, social workers, or hospice nurses.
It's a total reevaluation of life.
They return with a deep, unshakable conviction that everything in the universe is connected, and that love is the only actual currency that matters. The horrific physical trauma of dying doesn't leave them with crippling PTSD, it leaves them with profound post-traumatic growth.
Which raises an incredibly important logical question. If an NDE is truly just a dying brain hallucinating randomly due to a lack of oxygen and a flood of toxic carbon dioxide, why does it reliably produce the most positive, psychologically healing, morally elevating transformation a human being can undergo?
That's the paradox.
Hallucinations from severe fever, ICU delirium, or drug abuse leaves people shattered, confused, and traumatized. NDEs leave them whole. A broken dying machine doesn't accidentally produce enlightenment.
So what does this all mean? Let's bring this immense deep dive to a head and summarize the ultimate tension we've been exploring today. We are standing right at the bleeding edge of two mutually exclusive realities.
On one side, you have the traditional materialist view that the human brain is the ultimate unrivaled biological supercomputer, that it is capable of generating the most complex, time-dilated, hyper-lucid simulation imaginable in its dying seconds, acting as a supreme evolutionary defense mechanism against a terror of annihilation.
And on the other side, you have the view that consciousness is a fundamental, non-local force of the universe, just like gravity or electromagnetism, and that it merely uses the human brain as a temporary receiver, a biological vehicle, to navigate this specific, restricted, two-dimensional slice of physical reality.
It is the ultimate mystery of human existence. And as we wrap up, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, something to mull over that builds on the incredible cases we've discussed today.
If the antenna theory is correct, if consciousness truly does exist outside the biological brain, and if people like Pam Reynolds and Vicky the blind patient can form crystal clear, highly accurate, verifiable memories of their surgeries while their cerebral cortex is entirely flatlined and devoid of blood, where exactly are those new memories being stored?
If the biological hard drive is turned off, cooled to 60 degrees, and has no power running through it, where is the hard drive of the human soul located? And mathematically, how are those invisible memories carried back into the physical body and downloaded into the brain upon resuscitation?
It's a question that challenges the very foundation of what it means to be a living, thinking being.
We invite you to head back to our main channel. Dive deeper into these verified cases, Read the 2025 and 2026 clinical studies we mentioned and continue this incredible debate in the comments. Let us know which side of the line you fall on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We end today with a deep, profound intellectual respect for the sheer mystery of what it means to be alive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.